The mission required the ship to be moved 6,000 miles around Western Africa to the Eastern Mediterranean in anticipation of a war that had not started, and through an uncalculated error, too much provocation by Israel towards Egypt would start the war 10 days earlier than had been planned for months, and be almost over the time the Liberty reached its destination. The speed at which it proceeded, first to row to Spain to take on supplies and 4 additional crew members, 18 knots for 8 straight days, a highly unusual event, put the crew on high alert, leading to tensions between the crew members. The second part of their journey, 2,300 miles across the Mediterranean against headwinds of 30 to 40 knots, was also completed at full speed. Strangely, when it arrived there in the area, and that is the topmost part of the graph there, on the evening, actually that was at 6 o'clock in the morning on June the 8th, or 6:30 in the morning. After 2 weeks, it finally got into the area that it had been ordered to go. And after this 2-week frenetic effort to get the ship in position, on the evening of June 7th, when they finally reached their destination, 13 miles off the coast of Gaza, they found that all other ships, including the other spy ship, the USNS Private Jose F. Valdez, had been simultaneously ordered to leave the area. In fact, except for the Liberty and the then unknown presence of American submarines nearby, all other ships were ordered to remain 100 miles offshore. That order was supposedly intended for the Liberty as well, but for other mysterious reasons, it was never received by the ship. It was later determined that the message was intentionally never sent to the Liberty. On June 8, 1967, a beautiful sunny day in the Mediterranean Sea, as the Liberty sailed along at 5 knots, 13 miles off the Sinai, and note on this map, it never really approached the coast of Israel. It was always off the coast of Egypt. So sailing along with its large American flag flapping in the breeze, it was mercilessly attacked by Israeli jets with 30mm cannons, rockets, and napalm. The attack came at 2 p.m. Sinai time, 8 a.m. in Washington, after 11 to 13 Israeli overflights to identify and monitor the ship, the Liberty. There is no question, according to the survivors and every one of the U.S. Navy officers who investigated it, that Israel knew exactly what that ship was. Indeed, even some of the Israeli pilots have since admitted that they knew it was an American ship. The first attack came as a complete surprise to the crewmen, some of whom were sunbathing on the top deck, and was targeted to taking out gun mounts, the ship's antenna, and the bridge with heat-seeking missiles just before the attack. Well, just before the attack, the 5 radio frequencies used by the Liberty were jammed by the attackers, as well as the international distress frequency used for Mayday messages, a fact that proved conclusively that the Israeli High Command knew precisely which ship they were attacking. The Mirage fighter jets that first attacked the ship were unmarked. After the strafing by 2 pairs of fighter jets, 4 altogether, 3 Israeli motor torpedo gunboats then circled the severely damaged Liberty, even firing at crewmen who were trying to fight the fires, and later strafing the lifeboats that were filling with sailors who had been ordered to prepare to abandon ship, sinking 2 of them and destroying the non-deployed rest with gunfire. Intentional destruction of the lifeboats was contrary to international rules of engagement for any reason. During the attack, the Liberty sailors fought to keep the ship afloat and avoid being shot at by the Israeli gunboats, while its radio technicians scrambled to fix the communication equipment in order to call for help. By destroying the radio antenna on the deck, they intended to eliminate the ship's ability to immediately call for help. The ship managed to outmaneuver 4 torpedoes But there was a fifth one that could not be avoided. It left a 22-foot by 39-foot hole in the starboard side that should have sunk the ship. It failed only because it hit directly onto the I-beam of the underlying superstructure of the ship. And instead of proceeding through the ship, through the outer skin of the ship, it bounced back, exploding outside of the ship. That was a key event, just another miracle. There were a series of miracles that occurred. Some people, including one of the co-authors, feels very strongly that it was a series that had to be through divine intervention. The initial attack was aimed at destroying the Liberty's ability to communicate to the rest of the fleet by taking out all the antenna and gun mounts, and it succeeded, except for one transmitter and its antenna. Well, those had been shut down for maintenance. Therefore, it did not produce the heat sought by the missiles. During the first 10 to 20 minutes of the attack, sailor Terry Halberdier from San Angelo, Texas, dodged bullets and missiles and risked his life to string another cable to the undamaged antenna for that one transmitter they had left. His Silver Star citation, which he received 40 years after the event, reads, "Had it not been for Terry's bravery in the heat of the attack on the USS Liberty, most likely none of the survivors would still be here." The next two slides are probably the most important of the set, referencing two quotes from Admiral Lawrence Geiss, commander of the aircraft carrier USS America. Although the SOS message was received by the Sixth Fleet, which could have responded within 10 to 15 minutes and come to the Liberty's rescue, President Johnson and Defense Secretary McNamara, sitting safely in the White House Situation Room, ordered the fighter jets to immediately return to their aircraft carriers. As you see in the slide, McNamara said President Johnson is not going to go to war or embarrass an American ally over a few sailors. That was at 8:25 in the morning. That was before the torpedo hit, which didn't hit until about 20 minutes after that. That first sortie, by their mere presence, even the knowledge of the Israeli attackers that they were on the way, could have stopped the continuing attack, especially the later torpedo attack that took 24 more lives and injured about 150 more sailors. So McNamara, alone, sitting with LBJ in the Situation Room, did it the first time on his own, well, I mean, at the order of LBJ, as the air attack was still going on at 8:25. The second time, which had been held up for 90 minutes at Johnson's order, Admiral Geese asked McNamara for higher level validation of the order. The order was, well, let me go on here. In other words, he received a second order, even though he had already been given permission to wait for 90 minutes and then send help. After he did that, he was ordered by McNamara again to recall the wings and cancel the help. So Admiral Geese asked McNamara for higher level validation of the order. President Johnson got on the phone and told Admiral Geese that he did not care if every man drowned, the ship sank, but that he would not embarrass an ally. Then he said, "I want that goddamn ship going to the bottom. No help. Recall the wings." He did not want to embarrass his ally. That little slip revealed that he already knew who was conducting the attack. Even the men on board did not know that, until a few of them saw the Star of David flag on the motor torpedo boats, but not the Mirage fighter jets, nor the Mystere fighter jets that followed that, which went out and dropped napalm after being shot up. And the torpedo and all that, they dropped napalm on it to set the ship afire. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Thomas Moore, stated the U.S. military rescue aircraft were recalled not once but twice through direct intervention by the Johnson administration. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's cancellation of the Navy's attempt to rescue the Liberty, which I confirmed from the commanders of the aircraft carriers, America and Saratoga, was the most disgraceful act I witnessed in my entire military career. One of the survivors, who I'm not going to name, because he has not allowed it to be made public yet. Well, actually he has. He was on a radio show on the internet, so that's fine of it. But anyway, he determined through his investigation that the fifth torpedo was fired by a U.S. submarine, the Amberjack. This is a fact that I did not know when I wrote that first book. Wow. Now, it's unsubstantiated, but it's his firm opinion, and many of the survivors agree with it. Other survivors are not so sure about it. Because after all, it only came from that one man who, that Liberty survivor, was the worst injury of anyone on board who did not actually die. He would have died had it not been for someone else saving his life by coming up to him. As soon as he was shot, and his entire abdomen was opened out. His intestines were falling out. He was bleeding profusely. And this other fellow came up and held it all together for him until he could get medical help. That was just the first of his problems. After that, his Navy records were modified to try to make it seem that he was not even on the Liberty. And so he had to hire this investigator to go after people that he knew, or go to the people that he knew in the Pentagon and dig out the proof that he was really on board. And in the process of this, that's when his investigator discovered that big secret. Now in the meantime, two men who served on the Amberjack confirmed this to him personally. But here's the problem, that they would not allow him to use their names because of, well, it's a pretty incredible story, isn't it? This event has been sealed in the Pentagon. So that's the situation. He believes it, many people believe it, and if you add it all up, everything else we're learning here about what happened there, it seems rather plausible. Getting ahead of myself. Okay, so within hours, the cover-up begins. Johnson, through McNamara, ordered a very superficial Navy investigation to be conducted that was steered by the highest levels of the military hierarchy to accept the apology of Israel, which claimed that the attack was a case of mistaken identity, to keep the real story of what happened on June 8th from becoming known. An official cover-up was designed by its chief architect, Lyndon B. Johnson. The cover-up included personally delivered threats by a U.S. Navy admiral to all the officers and sailors aboard to keep their mouths shut about it forever, under penalty of courts-martial or worse, whatever that means. Such an order could only have emanated from the deluded commander-in-chief. The career Navy men agree with that point. That's not my assertion, it's theirs. Two admirals, three admirals actually. Even those, such as Captain Ward Boston, who were required to carry out those orders. He admitted in later years, it took him until 2004, but at least he came forward and admitted it was a sham. Following LBJ's orders, Admiral John S. McCain, the father of the senator from Arizona, ordered the Naval Court of Inquiry to deliberately falsify their report, to complement the Israeli story of a terrible mistake. McCain was then promoted to become commander of the Pacific Fleet, where he would conduct his own cover-up of his son's annex in starting a fire on the USS Forrestal that killed 134 men. Though, like all the other cover-ups, the truth was replaced by a myth. But I digress. That's another story. It's another even, well, it's just about as incredible as this story. LBJ went on national television and announced that only 4 sailors were killed in the 6-minute accidental attack, instead of 34 sailors killed in a 2-hour sustained intentional attack, and 174 others were injured, not 53, as announced, as you can see in this newspaper clip. No laughter. Shortly before he died, Captain Magano, the captain of the USS Liberty, told Lieutenant George Golden, one of the senior officers on board the ship, it was the President and McNamara, when they sent us up from over in Africa, we were there to have this happen. McNamara had always believed that he had to perform his duties as a classic yes man. In this perverted version of being a team player, there was no allowance for one to speak his own mind when it came to discussions of the merits and the pros and the cons and the judgments of policy, not to mention morality or even legalities. He once said, I don't believe the government of a complicated, this is a quote, I don't believe the government of a complicated state can operate effectively if those in charge of the departments of the government express disagreement with decisions of the established head of that government. In other words, that was the end of the quote. In other words, he had come to agree with Johnson that whatever the president ordered him to do, regardless of the niceties of due process, the fealty to constitutional governance, the mundane observation of moral principles or ethical standards, even the impediments related to basic legalities, he would follow his orders without question. Exhibit A, Vietnam. This is why Israel has always considered the 1967 Six-Day War an astounding success. You see the third graphic from the left, going right. The third one was how Israel existed with its territories, its boundaries on June the 5th, 1968. 5 days later, at the end of the Six-Day War, the one on the far right indicates the boundaries of Israel and the greatly diminished territories of Palestine. Those areas that were absorbed are still considered by every country in the world, except for Israel and the United States at least, as occupied territories. So yes, LBJ left his imprint on the U.S. and the world, but it's not quite what the government and the LBJ Library would have you believe. In fact, much of the turmoil in the Middle East today can be assigned to Lyndon Johnson. The brutal, sustained 2-hour Israeli attack on the Liberty ironically strengthened the relationship between the two countries, the result of a sort of discreet blackmail that still exists today, which explains why no one wants to even discuss it, to even bring it up, today risks being cast as anti-Semitic. But the attack on the Liberty was not their idea. In fact, I'm actually, through this book and the previous book, trying to say that Israel should not be blamed for this. They did it. That is true. They didn't want to. In fact, Yitzhak Rabin went to the godfather of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, in the days, in fact, just 2 days before the Liberty left Abidjan on May 21st, and revealed to him the plan. And he had not heard of it yet. And he just exploded with fury. He was furious over this plan, so furious that Yitzhak Rabin had a mental collapse before the war even started. He sat out the war. He was ill. So they went to Moshe Dayan, and he said, yeah, okay, we can do that. The problem with the plan was that it went off track. When the war started too early, it started 10 days earlier than the schedule. This is a schedule that had been worked out months ago. Actually, this plan started about 3 years before. Okay, if you can accept that, it's all explained in the new book. I touched on it in the first book, but the new book adds much more facts to that. So it started 10 days too early. When the ship finally arrived there, into its position on June the 8th, the war was practically over. There was no point to it anymore. It was supposed to be there on the first day of the war, but they blew that. Anybody else with half a brain or a sense of morality at all, even though he had started this whole thing, the process, would have at least canceled it at that point. Because then, now you're saying that, he's tried to say at least, that Egypt attacked his ship. This was 5 days or 4 days after the entire Egyptian Air Force had been destroyed by Israel in their surprise attack. They have no airplanes up there. But he thought he could make it stick, because he thought he could do anything. The point is this: we now have a complete record of this madman's real legacy, and it ain't what they celebrate down in Austin. We have demonstrated within this book that Johnson was the provocateur of this attack on his own ship. If a man can be so venal as to manipulate his own ship into being attacked with the full intent for it to sink, so that he can use that as a pretext to declare war on Egypt and other Arab nations around Israel, even risking intervention by the Soviet Union in the process, all for the sake of garnering more votes in the 1968 election. He wanted it as a pretext because of the beautiful way that the Tonkin Gulf resolution allowed him to have a landslide election 3 months later after that false flag. So he wanted to pull off an even bigger one. So what else could he be capable of? Well, how about the successful false flag operation for Vietnam that I just mentioned? And then what about all the other 1960s assassinations? For anyone who believes that only the CIA could concoct the plan and execute it and kill JFK and have LBJ just playing along as a puppet, consider this. That might be plausible. It might be possible for JFK's assassination on the premise that it was a national security risk and they were doing the patriotic thing. But how do you explain the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King on that basis? And what about these two false flag operations? Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to finish with this. Finally, the complete story of the attack on the USS Liberty has been assembled from the fragments that were exposed over the last 5 decades. And like my other books, I have used as other books that have been written as the source for this one. That's true. I do a certain amount of cherry picking, but I also am always looking for at the books that have tried to portray it in the official government story. And in that sense, I have to basically destroy their credibility in order to make this thesis make sense. And so that's what has been done here as well. Okay, I'm going to skip the rest of that so that I can take some questions. I only have a few minutes left, I believe. Any questions?
Bill Barmore here in Boston, Texas. Please invite. Hey Phil, I'm really glad you're writing this book on the USS Liberty. The 50th anniversary is coming up next year, as you told everybody. You go into the role of Lyndon Johnson, which I think is a given that he was behind the attack on the Liberty. Who else would you put as the most culpable people in the U.S. government who were totally in on the plan and who knew in advance what Johnson was up to?
Well, I would start with all of those who he gave the orders to, who went along with the plan, starting right there in the White House, actually next door in the Executive Office building, with Walt Rostow, who was the chairman of what was called the 303 committee. Essentially the same kind of committee that JFK had. It was called a special group. And then when Robert Kennedy took it over, it was called the Special Group Augmented. And it's been known as the 40 Committee under Nixon and various other things. I think now it's simply referred to as the National Security Council.
What about Cyrus Vance? What do you think about his possible involvement?
Well, yes, he was one of those. That I haven't listed them all, but I listed the chairman of that committee and others. There were 6 members of that committee, and Cyrus Vance was one of them that facilitated the plan. In other words, they were given the order by Johnson. This goes back at least to maybe 3 years. Actually, I would argue for 3 years. I think the plan actually was a germ of an idea that Johnson planted in the summer of 1964. Because as early as July of 65, there were already men assigned and sent to Israel to start preparing for this. And to start training the troops over there, or the officers at least, and to try to coordinate and plan all the logistics and what have you.
And so you would certainly indict Robert McNamara.
Oh yeah, of course, absolutely. I mean, he was, as I read from his quote, he not only went along with it, but and then later, there's a great documentary. If you haven't seen this before, you've got to make a note of this and go home and Google it. It's called BBC documentary, Dead in the Water. It's over an hour. It's like an hour and 10 minutes, but it's very definitely worth the investment. You will see in that documentary almost everything I've talked about here, but you'll see it graphically. You'll see the people who, were interviewed that survived this. Many of them are on there. So it's a very interesting story. They will not have. None of the videos, none of the books have gone quite as far as I have in both of these books to tag it to Lyndon Johnson. That they stop. They sort of dance around that point, and they say it could only have been, we think. But I haven't stopped there. I believe we proved it had to be him who dreamed it up.
Hi there.
Hello.
I wanted to thank you for your interview you did some years ago with Dr. Jim Fetzer on the radiofetzer.blogspot.com when your book on Lyndon came out. It was a very eye-opening experience, and to you and to, well, everybody, but especially presenters. When Dennis Dennis David, the friend of Colonel Peitzer, was speaking yesterday night. He kind of was a bit uncomfortable with being called a hero, but he was okay with being called a patriot. But the act of heroism is doing what you feel and see and you know is right. So I really wanted to thank you and Dr. Fetzer and everybody for their heroism, for doing this work, and in your case, of course, because you're in front of me, for your amazing work in expanding these larger areas focused on one man, but all kinds of world stuff that contributed to the Kennedy assassination and continues. So in a way, I would say thank you for being a hero and also for your interview content. That is what heroism is. So you can call yourself whatever, but thank you very much for your books.
To me, a hero is one that actually puts their lives at risk. I don't feel like I've done that. Sure.
Hi, I want to thank you for this. This was an amazing talk. There's a couple of things. One is there's a movie script, or actually maybe two of them, but I know one that's been written, and they need money to make this.
I'm glad you made that point.
And is that going to take in your book?
Well, I've pledged to the survivors who contributed this to put 50% of all revenue that this might generate into that fund, with no limitation on time.
Okay, so the comment I want to make is there's an old quote from Napoleon: "He who controls Palestine controls the world," and that's because that area is the land bridge between Africa and Eurasia.
Right.
And the other false flag incidents I want to bring up are the affair in Egypt, which is what this election was about, and it appears that Trump has put a monkey wrench into those plans.
Well, I hope you're right about that, at least.
But I mean, that I've always looked at it as Israel wanting us to go to war for them. You're saying that the U.S. wants us to go to war to get that area, using things via Israel, such as, all the Israeli intelligence agents in Manhattan, the dancing Israelis, the art students, and what have you. Well, how do you look at it in view of those other three false flags?
Okay, I think you have a strong point. However, I think that in this particular case, this is a very personal, just like the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. I don't think you can argue that there was a national security element involved in that. They were very personal. LBJ always wanted to have Bobby Kennedy killed. In fact, he even told that consistently to his friends. And one of his friends, Ed Clark, even told it to Robert Caro. And Robert Caro put it in the last book. He said, basically, when the subject of Robert Kennedy came up, Johnson would always invariably take his thumb and go like this. He said, "I'll cut his throat if it's the last thing I do." Now, after he wrote that, Caro then segued into some other stuff that had nothing to do with, in other words, he just left it at that. Well, I think you have to draw some conclusions. You have to draw some, points from those kinds of comments, but he doesn't want to go there. And of course, he didn't want to even go near the JFK assassination. So I think it was a very personal thing with Lyndon Johnson, that whole business. It had to do with his reelection, period. But he was trying to help Israel in a way. But even though David Ben-Gurion had nothing to do with it. But it's too late. Dr. Fetzer.
Phil, would you agree with my conclusion that this latest book by David Talbot, The Devil's Chessboard, is a very elaborate, detailed, thoroughly researched vis-a-vis Allen Dulles, but basically a disinformation attempt to distract attention away from the prime mover, the key player, Lyndon B. Johnson?
Yes, I agree with that. And as a matter of fact, I wrote a review of that book. and initially gave it a 4.5 rating, which rounded back up to 5. But then, that was after the first quick read. Then I went back and reread it slowly and ploddingly. And I saw some other things that didn't make sense to me. So after that, I dropped it to a 4. And I explained it all in that review. If anybody's interested, it's on Amazon.
Would you give us a thumbnail of McNamara's involvement in relation to the assassination of the president he purportedly served, meaning JFK, and of the Bundy's role here too? It seems as though JFK was surrounded by persons who were ready to betray him as Brutus did Julius Caesar.
I think a strong case could be made that for both Rostow, McNamara, and some others, possibly even Bundy. I think that, however, to see other things that he in particular said, I don't know. I think that's a little more iffy, but it's my personal opinion, and of course it's my personal opinion on the others as well. I'm not so sure that McNamara had an involvement myself. You know, just the way he was so glibly, you know, I mean, he took the position many times. And one was with the interview by Noel Twyman, where you know, he said, yes, you could make an argument that Johnson did this and this and this, and it was all illegal, but it's a big jump from that to assassinating the assassination of the president. So I'm not completely convinced that he was, but I don't think there's a doubt in my mind about Walt Rostow.
What are the details of that?
Well, Rostow and McBundy and others, but they were really led by Rostow. That you know, it was all that business of the falling dominoes and that they were ripe for taking on Vietnam, and they were pushing it as almost as strongly as Johnson himself. Although I think they were all being led around. In fact, the Pentagon, the CIA, they were all being led throughout 62 and 63 into that. I think they would have been a little more, okay, I think they would have been a little less likely to have been involved with any other man in that position if they would have had a vice president other than Lyndon Johnson. Anyway, that's it.
Thank you, Bill.